Have you ever felt like someone was following you? Not a shadow, not a person, but something that knows how you walk, breathe, even think. This isn't your typical ghost story. This is a true story about a woman who grew up in a house that was never truly empty, about invisible creatures that didn't just appear, but stayed, about voices coming from the vents, footsteps with no source, and reflections of faces that aren't hers. And the most terrifying part? Whatever she's seen is now starting to mimic her, until no one knows who's really still alive. If you think you're safe, watch this story until the end. And pay attention to who's sitting next to you. This story comes from a girl named Sarah. At the time of the incident, she was only 12 years old. She and her family had just moved into their new home, a 2-story colonial-style house on the outskirts of a small town in Oregon. From the outside, the house looked perfect. Clean white paint, a neatly manicured front yard, and a quiet neighborhood. But as soon as they stepped inside, Sarah felt something was off. The air inside the house felt heavy, not because of the temperature, but as if something was filling the space. Something invisible but palpable. No one mentioned it at the time, but the strange feeling seemed to cling to the walls and floors. The first night in the house marked the beginning of all the oddities. Around 1 a.m, Sarah was awakened by the sound of footsteps on the floor above. Slow, steady, as if someone was walking back and forth in the hallway. At first, she thought it was her brother, but when she opened her bedroom door and peeked out, there was no one there. The hallway was dark and silent, and the footsteps stopped the moment the door opened. The next morning, her mother asked if anyone had turned on the TV the night before, but no one admitted to it. Her mother said the TV in the living room had turned on by itself, volume maxed out, displaying a white screen filled with static. Her father immediately unplugged it that night. But strangely, the next night, the cable was plugged back in, and none of them knew who had done it. In the days that followed, Sarah began to see something. Not a full apparition, but a white shadow darting quickly at the corner of her eye. In the kitchen, in the hallway, even behind the window curtains. When she tried to look directly, everything vanished. Once, she saw a pale white face peering through the crack under her bedroom door. Silent, unmoving, but it disappeared the moment she screamed. The bathroom no longer felt safe either. The warm water suddenly turned cold and chilling. On the steamed-up mirror, there were handprints, even though Sarah was sure she hadn't touched the glass. Objects began moving on their own. A glass that had been on the kitchen counter suddenly appeared on the upper shelf. The kitchen cabinet opened by itself at night. Then one night, a loud noise sounded like something had hit the living room window, as if a large bird had collided with the glass. But when she checked, there was nothing outside. No wind, no animals. The most terrifying thing for Sarah was when she woke up hearing heavy breathing. Not from herself, but from the end of the bed. When she opened her eyes, she saw a pair of small eyes reflecting the light from the window. Those eyes were staring at her, motionless. Sarah closed her eyes, held her breath, and didn't move until morning. Finally, the family started sleeping in the same room. The lights were left on all night. No one really wanted to talk about what they had experienced. But one thing was certain, they all felt the same way. The house was never truly empty. 2 years after they moved, when Sarah was 14, her parents hired a babysitter to look after her when they had to travel out of town for the weekend. Her name was Melissa, a middle-aged woman who seemed friendly and cheerful. But from the first night in the house, Melissa's attitude began to change. She chose to sleep in the guest room on the ground floor. The room was rarely used, but it looked neat and clean. In the corner of the room was an old doll that Sarah had kept since she was a child, a gift from her late grandmother. The doll had never seemed scary before, but that night, everything felt different. Around 2 a.m, Melissa woke Sarah up, pale and trembling. She said she heard whispers coming from the bedroom vent. At first, they were faint, like sighs, but gradually, the whispers grew louder, as if someone was calling her name repeatedly. Sarah turned toward the living room. The light was on by itself. The doll, which should have been sitting still on the chair, had fallen to the floor, facing the bedroom. Melissa swore she saw the doll's head move slightly. It wasn't the wind. It was as if something was holding it and turning it slowly. That night, they slept together in Sarah's room. But the problem wasn't over. Their family pet Max started acting strangely. He sat in front of the living room door for hours, barking at the vent with a low, angry voice. His eyes were fixed. His tail didn't move an inch. It was as if he was seeing something invisible to humans. The next day, Sarah tried to calm herself by playing music through her old toy, a small dog-shaped robot named iDog. But when she touched it, the toy turned on by itself without being touched beforehand. Its indicator light turned bright red, even though its default color had always been blue. On the second night, Melissa heard the sound again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. Instead, it was a soft, childlike giggle, as if children were playing, yet there was no one downstairs. She went up to Sarah's room without saying a word, sat on the floor holding the small Bible she had brought with her. Her body trembled. The living room was never the same after that. The lights often flickered. The TV turned on by itself even after being unplugged. The doll was eventually stored in the attic, but none of them dared to open that door alone. Since that weekend, no one wanted to sleep in the guest room anymore. Even Sarah's parents began to feel that something silent was there, watching, waiting. Not aggressive, but its presence was too real to ignore. Every time night fell, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew colder. The walls seemed to emit a soft hum, and from the ventilation, something could still be heard. Not a sound, more like a breath. A few years after the incident in the guest room, Sarah began trying to escape from the house. One way she did this was by joining the hiking club at her school. She felt that nature gave her breathing space, far away from the walls of her house that felt like they were watching her. During spring break, she and some friends went on a camping trip to one of the national forests in Northern California, a place known for its tranquility and beauty, but also for its dark secrets. The trip started smoothly. They hiked through towering pine trees and followed a rarely used trail. But on the second day, the atmosphere changed. Sarah felt like she was being watched, not by animals, but by something trying to hide its presence. On the first night at camp, when all her friends were asleep in their tents, Sarah woke up to a faint sound, like someone talking. She went outside with a small flashlight, thinking there was a stranger who had wandered into the campsite. But there was no one there, only rows of trees and the rustling of leaves. She returned to her tent and tried to ignore it. However, the sound returned the following night. This time, it sounded like a child crying, but the voice was too far away and too faint, as if coming from the depths of the forest. Some of his friends also began to complain about feeling uneasy. One of them had a nightmare about pale faces peering out from behind the trees. As they ventured further into the forest, they found the carcass of a deer. But strangely, the deer's body wasn't torn apart like it had been attacked by an animal. Its skin was intact, but its eyes were empty. Its tongue was blue, as if it had died without cause. Their friend, majoring in biology, said this wasn't a typical attack. The local guide accompanying them only said briefly, "This forest sometimes calls out with human voices." A statement that left them all speechless. Sarah began reading about the legend of the Wendigo, a creature from Native American mythology said to be able to mimic human voices to lure its victims. The more she dug, the more stories she found about people who had gone missing in that forest. Hundreds in the past 2 decades. Some were never found. Others were found in confusing conditions. No wounds, but no soul. The last night at the camp was the most terrifying. As the campfire died down and the sky grew cloudy, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind the trees. Not the sound of animals. The footsteps were too precise, too human. But when they shone their flashlights, there was only a tree and a thin mist. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She just stared at the tent ceiling and held her breath every time she heard the sound of a branch breaking. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or something calling from the darkness. Since returning from that trip, Sarah never went on another outdoor adventure. She stopped camping. Even a simple night walk made her uneasy, because she knew whatever she felt in that forest wasn't just a legend. It was real. A few months after returning from the forest, Sarah began to experience more severe sleep disturbances. But this time, it wasn't because of the house, nor was it because of the noises. It was something that appeared. Physically, she remembered that night very well. At around 3 in the morning, she woke up feeling something touching her leg. At first, she thought it was a blanket slipping off. But when she pulled it back, she felt small claws scratching her calf. It wasn't a dream. The wounds were real. 3 straight scratches like animal claws. But her room was locked tight. There were no cats, no animals of any kind in the house. A few days later, Sarah locked herself in her room because of a mild fever. Her mother left food outside the door, but Sarah didn't touch it. She dared not go out. Every night, she felt something crawling on the floor, slowly approaching. She could hear small claws scraping against the wood. But when the light was turned on, the room was always empty. One night, she decided to wait in the dark. Only the faint light from the window accompanied her. And there she saw it. It was small, about the size of a terrier. But it wasn't an animal. Its body was covered in thick hair on its back. But its face was bald and wrinkled. Its eyes were large, reflecting light like an insect. The creature stood in the corner of the room, silent, tilting its head. Then it moved fast, too fast. It went under the bed. Sarah screamed. Her father came in, turned on all the lights, but found nothing. They thought it was a fever-induced hallucination, but the scratch marks on her thigh were unexplainable. What made it even more terrifying was that a few days later, her 7-year-old cousin came to stay. The child cried hysterically on the first night, saying there was an ugly doll sitting in the corner of the room, staring at him all night. Sarah knew it wasn't coincidence. Similar incidents began to be experienced by other family members. Her mother started having nightmares about small creatures lurking in the kitchen. Her father felt like he was being watched when he sat alone in his study. Their dog, Max, refused to enter Sarah's room and even barked at the ceiling every night. Finally, they called a spiritualist they knew through a church acquaintance. He came with incense and oil, then performed a kind of cleansing ritual. While in Sarah's room, he suddenly stopped and said softly, "This isn't new. It was here before this house was built." The ritual lasted more than 2 hours. After that, a smell like burning flesh spread throughout the house. There was no fire. Nothing was burning, but the smell was pungent and made everyone vomit. Since that night, the disturbances from the small creatures did decrease. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. She often woke up to the sound of claws scraping the floor. Sometimes she heard rapid breathing under the bed, and occasionally a soft laugh, like the laughter of a child playing. But there were no children in that house. And Sarah never slept in the dark again. At 17, Sarah began actively using social media. She felt safer sharing her stories online than talking about them directly to the people around her. But that sense of security didn't last long. One night, she received a message from an unknown account. It was simple, just one sentence. "I've been watching you sleep." Sarah thought it was a prank. She ignored it, but the messages kept coming. They were always sent at the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. The messages varied. Sometimes they were about the clothes she was wearing, sometimes about her sleeping position. Each day, the messages became more detailed. She began to suspect that someone was stalking her. But who? One rainy night, when her parents were out of town, Sarah was alone at home. Around 2:15 a.m., she heard a soft knock on her bedroom window. She lived on the 2nd floor. It was impossible for anyone to be standing outside the window. But the knock was clear, soft, repeated. She looked toward the curtain. There was a shadow behind it. Not the shadow of a tree branch, but the silhouette of a person. Sarah backed away slowly, trying to reach her phone. But before she could call, the knocking turned into scraping, like nails dragging across glass. She ran to the bathroom and locked herself in. For almost 2 hours, she sat on the floor, listening to the soft footsteps outside. No alarm went off. There were no signs that the house had been broken into, but Sarah knew someone or something was there. The next day, the police came. There were no footprints in the yard, no fingerprints, But one of the officers found something that made Sarah tremble. Small handprints on the outside of the window. Not children's hands. Too long, too thin, and the number of fingers, not 5. The police called it a prank. They suggested installing cameras. But Sarah knew this wasn't just a human disturbance. Over the next few days, she found small objects moved out of place. Some of her underwear went missing and then reappeared, neatly folded on her desk. On her phone, there were screenshots of messages she had never opened. And most terrifying of all, there was a photo of her sleeping, taken from an angle of the room that could only be reached from inside. Her father immediately installed additional locks on every door. They added motion sensor lights, security cameras, and even called a close family friend to stay with Sarah for several weeks. But the sense of safety never truly returned. Sarah began taking naps during the day and staying awake at night. She would sit in the corner of her room with a small knife in her hand. Sometimes she would cry silently. Other times she would just stare blankly at the window, which was now always tightly shut. One night, she found words scrawled under her desk. "No door can stop me." When Sarah turned 18, her life seemed to enter a new, darker chapter. It wasn't because of her home or the invisible creatures that continued to follow her. It was because of someone real, a man who entered her mother's life, bringing with him a long, suffocating shadow. His name was Ray, a grown man who initially seemed warm and pleasant. He came as her mother's new boyfriend after Sarah's father left home for reasons that were never explained. But it didn't take long for Sarah to realize that Ray's smile hid something else. Behind closed doors, Ray often shouted, not just at her mother, but at himself. He spoke in a language Sarah didn't understand, as if talking to someone else. Sometimes he laughed alone, then cried in silence. Sarah once caught him standing in the dark dining room, staring at the wall for nearly an hour without blinking. Ray began to control their lives. He forbade her mother from speaking to the neighbors. He hung black curtains on every window. He even turned off the internet for days on end, just to prevent any foreign waves from entering the house. Sarah's mother changed. Her face grew pale, her body grew thin, and her eyes were empty. Sarah knew her mother was taking something, medicine or maybe drugs, but she also knew it wasn't just because of the substances. Ray had done something to her mind, as if he had washed away her memories and made her believe the outside world was dangerous. In Ray's room, there was a large corkboard filled with photos, strange symbols, and red threads connecting unfamiliar faces. In one corner of the board, there was a photo of Sarah sleeping on the sofa. She didn't know when the photo was taken. Ray often spoke of a brotherhood in the darkness. He called it a group that guards a boundary between humans and the underworld. Sarah thought it was a delusion, but one night, she saw it herself. 3 men came to the house without a sound. They entered, spoke briefly with Ray, then sat in a circle in the living room. They didn't bring anything. They didn't eat. They didn't drink. They just sat there, eyes closed, for 3 hours. After that night, Ray became more violent. He threw things, broke picture frames, and punched the walls until his hands bled. Sarah was once dragged out of her room just for playing music softly. She almost called the police, but her mother stopped her and said in a trembling voice, "Don't disturb him. We'll all be gone." Sarah began to believe that Ray wasn't just a crazy man. He brought something with him, something that wasn't entirely from this world, because the house felt darker since he arrived, colder, and the nights grew longer. Until one morning, Ray was found lifeless in the basement. His body was frozen in a sitting position, his eyes wide open staring toward the stairs. There were no wounds, no blood, only a sharp, cold smell that pierced the bone. The police called it a heart attack, but Sarah saw something on the basement wall, a carving that had never been there before, a split circle, and beneath it, one word, return. After Ray's death, the house became quieter, but only for a while, because what came after him wasn't just memories. It was something that quietly took its place again, unwelcome. Sarah started working part-time at a small university in Seattle, handling documents and logistics in the campus administration department. She hoped the new environment would erase the remnants of darkness from her life. But in reality, what had been clinging to her all this time didn't die with Ray. One night, she came home late from work and decided to walk through the empty hallway of an old building on campus. The building was supposed to be abandoned, but as she passed in front of one of the dark classrooms, she saw it. A little girl was standing in the room. She was wearing a worn white dress. Her hair was braided and her face was pale. But what made Sarah's blood freeze was her eyes. They were empty like glass balls. The girl just stood there silently, then slowly tilted her head and disappeared as a hallway light flickered once. Sarah didn't report it. She knew no one would believe her. A few days later, a co-worker told her about strange occurrences at the office. The printer turned on by itself and printed blank sheets of paper with faint handprints. In the break room, coffee cups moved on their own. Security cameras recorded odd activity at night. Chairs moving by themselves. Shadows crossing the hallway even though the building was locked. Sarah began to suspect that something had come with her from home. And not just one thing. In her apartment, she started experiencing strange occurrences. The mirror in the bathroom showed the reflection of another person standing behind her, even though she was alone. When she turned around, there was no one there. But when she looked back at the mirror, the reflection remained. One night, she saw herself walking toward the kitchen. But Sarah was sitting on the bed. This other version of herself was wearing the same clothes, but her eyes looked darker. She stood at the doorway, staring silently for 5 seconds before slowly backing up and disappearing into the dark hallway. Sarah tried to record the incident, but every time she set up the camera, the battery suddenly died. The files were gone, or recorded, but only showed static and a buzzing sound like a broken frequency. One afternoon, while alone in the office, she found an email from an unknown address. The subject line was blank, but inside was just one sentence. You're not alone at your workplace. Along with the email, someone sent a photo, a screenshot from the surveillance camera of the old campus building. In the photo, Sarah was standing in the middle of the hallway. The problem was, she had never been there at that time. And what was even more unsettling, the version of herself in the photo was smiling. After the photo incident, Sarah began to feel unsafe even in public places. She, who used to enjoy walking in the afternoon or jogging in the morning, now began to be wary of every step, every shadow, every small sound following her from behind. One autumn afternoon, Sarah was walking home from the grocery store just 2 blocks from her apartment. The streets were deserted. The air was cold. The sky was overcast. But she was not alone. She heard a faint echo behind her. When she stopped, the sound stopped too. When she turned around, the street was empty. She quickened her pace, her shopping bag swaying in her hands. But the sound was getting closer. It wasn't the sound of one person. More than one. But there was no one in the shop windows she passed. Not in the shadows of the parked cars. Not in the apartment windows. It was as if the footsteps were coming from a place that had no form. When she was almost at her apartment door, a hand touched her shoulder from behind. Sarah turned around as quickly as she could, but there was only empty air and her shopping bags fell to ground. The next day, while jogging in the city park, someone was actually following her. A tall man in a dark hoodie, walking slowly but steadily. Sarah noticed his shadow growing behind her every time the sun peeked through the trees. She tried to stop and pull over to the fountain. The man stopped too. He pretended to tie his shoelaces. He looked away. But when Sarah started running again, his footsteps followed. She decided to cross the street to a busier area, but the sound was still behind her. Finally, she stopped at a coffee shop and went inside. The man didn't come in, but stood across the street, staring through the dark car window. He didn't move for more than 10 minutes. The barista offered her a seat in the back. Sarah agreed, but when she went to the restroom, something startled her. One of the bathroom walls was covered in black marker scribbles. The scribbles resembled strange symbols she had once seen in Ray's basement. Among the symbols was a sentence that made her heart skip a beat. No matter where you go, I'm closer than your shadow. Sarah immediately left the cafe and ordered an online taxi. When she looked at the rearview mirror of the car taking her home, the hoodie-clad man was still standing in the same spot. But when the streetlights came on and the car started moving, his figure suddenly vanished from sight, as if it passed through the asphalt. Since then, Sarah never went out alone again. Every step, every reflection in the glass, every small sound made her body stiff, because now she knew what was following her wasn't just a human. Sometime later, Sarah tried to calm her mind by joining a small spiritual community on a trip to the Appalachian Mountains, where they encouraged people to reconnect with nature. She didn't fully believe in the group's purpose, but thought that the mountain air and distance from the city might help her sleep without interruption. The first few days were peaceful. Morning mist shrouded the treetops, and the air felt clean in her lungs. They camped in small tents near a valley said to have once been a migration route for indigenous people. But by the third night, the tranquility began to crack. Around 4 a.m, one of the participants woke everyone up because they heard a long, eerie sound coming from the forest. The sound didn't resemble any ordinary animal. Not a wolf, not a bear. It sounded like a human imitating an animal. Sarah immediately felt that familiar sensation again, tension in the back of her neck, her breath suddenly heavy. The next day, they found a deer carcass on the hiking trail. Its body was emaciated, as if all the flesh had been sucked out. Its tongue was hanging out, and its skin was torn open with no signs of bites. Sarah recognized the shape. It was the same as what she had seen years ago in the California forest. One of the local guides told them that this area was not far from the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans had been forced to walk to their deaths. There were many stories about skinny creatures, tall, with voices like humans, that appear among the trees when the moon was covered by fog. Sarah listened in silence. She didn't need folklore to know something was moving among the nighttime bushes. On the 5th night, they built a campfire, but the flames weren't enough to ward off the sudden chill that pierced their bones. Sarah felt a throbbing headache, and when she looked toward the dark hill across the valley, she saw it, a tall figure, over 2 meters tall. Its body was very thin, its skin like rotting flesh pulled tightly over bones. Its eyes were jet black. The creature stood behind 2 trees, silent. It didn't move. It didn't come closer, but its presence was oppressive, rendering Sarah unable to speak or move. Her friends saw nothing, but 2 of them complained that their camera equipment had suddenly malfunctioned. Their flashlights went out simultaneously, and one of the compasses changed direction, as if the gravity around them was being manipulated by something massive. When they finally returned to the car and left the area, Sarah glanced back one last time. At the end of the dirt road, between 2 large rocks, the creature was still standing. It didn't chase them. It didn't attack. It just waited. After returning from the mountains, Sarah tried to blend back into city life. She changed her phone number, moved apartments, and even changed her lifestyle. But none of that changed the fact that the shadows of her past continued to follow her, appearing in unexpected places, as if every encounter was part of something unfinished. One weekend, Sarah was invited by a college friend to join a documentary trip to a small old town in Idaho. It was a former mining town that was now almost completely deserted. Only a few hundred people lived there, and most of the buildings were abandoned. They planned to make a video about the history of the place, but what they found was far from something that could be shown to the public. On the first day, they explored the remains of an old, dilapidated school. Dust covered every window. On the second floor, Sarah found a classroom with chairs still neatly arranged. But what sent a chill down her spine was a small wooden doll with a face drawn in charcoal on one of the benches. Its eyes were large, and its mouth was grinning. Her friend suggested it might be a local resident's toy, but Sarah didn't believe it, because when she took a photo of the room, the doll didn't appear in the picture. Only an empty chair remained. That night, they stayed at a local resident's house that rented out rooms. When everyone was asleep, Sarah was awakened by a scraping sound on the floor above. She climbed up slowly and saw the attic door slightly open. When she touched the handle, the sound stopped, but behind the door, she heard breathing. Short, quick, like the sound of children hiding. The next morning, one of them lost a drone they had used to record the city from the air. They found it 2 hours later, crashed near an old cemetery. The drone's final footage showed something inexplicable. A woman dressed in 19th century clothing standing on the main road, staring up at the sky. But as the camera zoomed in, the woman turned away from the camera, and her face was gone. Not shattered, not covered, but completely empty. Flat skin, no eyes, nose, or mouth. Sarah kept the video a secret. On the last day, before they returned home, one of the team members went missing. They found him 2 hours later, sitting inside a wardrobe in the inn's room, hugging his knees, his eyes vacant. He didn't remember his name. He didn't know how he got there. And his hands were clutching a small piece of wood shaped like the same doll's face from the school. Sarah returned to the city in silence. She never uploaded any recordings from the trip, but she knew that everything she had experienced so far was interconnected, as if something or someone was pulling threads from all these stories and weaving them into a pattern she couldn't yet understand. And in the middle of the night, when she looked at her laptop screen, the reflection that sometimes appeared wasn't hers. After the incident in the mining town, Sarah decided to return to her old house in Oregon, where it all began. Not to settle down, but to end something. The house had been empty for almost 2 years. No one dared to rent or buy it. The neighbor said that the nights around the house always felt colder. And the attic window sometimes opened by itself. She brought a camera, a flashlight, and a small notebook filled with her experiences, trying to connect the dots. But that wasn't what she was looking for. What she was after was the basement, the place where Ray was last seen, the place that was only whispered about, but never truly understood. The front door was still the same, old with that creak when opened. Dust clung to every corner, and the air inside was frozen. Even when sunlight filtered through the torn curtains, the house felt like it had been sealed shut for centuries. Sarah immediately went down to the basement. The wooden stairs were rotten. Each step made a whispering sound. The walls were covered in moss. The concrete floor was damp. And in the farthest corner from the main light, there was a faded circle on the floor, a ritual mark that had faded but still held something. There, the old symbol was still written. The circle was split, and one word, return. But now there was something new. Next to the writing, there was a fresh scribble. It looked recent, as if written only a few days ago. Sarah's name, 3 times. She squinted, trying to wipe away the paint, but her fingertips left black smudges on her skin. The ink felt warm, as if it were still alive. Suddenly, the light above her went out. Total darkness. Sarah raised her flashlight, but the light was weak, too weak, as if the room was absorbing light like a black hole. In the silence, she heard a familiar sound. Not footsteps, not whispers, but breathing, just like she had heard before in the bathroom, in the hallway, in the tent, in every place that had ever been touched by this darkness. But this time, the breathing was close, very close, right behind her. She turned around. There was no one there. But the wall behind her was now covered with something that had never been there before, a large, old mirror with an iron frame. Sarah had never seen it there before. The mirror was dusty, but when she touched it, a thin mist spread and revealed a reflection. That was not hers. The reflection stared back at her with a face that looked familiar, but paler. Its eyes were completely black. And when the reflection smiled, Sarah did not. The reflection raised its hand, slowly pressing its palm against the inside of the glass. And from behind the reflection, a soft voice echoed, faint but clear, "Now it's your turn." After the incident in the basement, Sarah did not return to the house. She left behind her camera, notebook, and even her jacket. All she took with her was herself, and something that was now attached to her. She felt it inside her body, not like before. This was no longer an external influence, but something had entered and taken a place that had once belonged only to her. A week later, Sarah began losing track of time. She would wake up and find messages on her phone that she didn't remember typing. She'd find herself standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night, holding a knife without knowing why. One night, she woke up with her feet covered in mud and wet leaves, as if she'd just walked home from the forest. But the apartment door was locked from the inside. Always, What truly terrified her was what happened in the bathroom. When she turned on the light, she saw writing on the fogged-up glass. Not someone else's name, but her own, written over and over. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. Then below it, one sentence. The letters were larger, slanted, as if scratched with nails. Not yours. She tried to seek help, psychiatrists, psychics, even priests. But every time someone tried to recite a prayer or perform a ritual, something strange happened. The electricity went out. Windows shattered. One priest even vomited blood when he touched her forehead. Sarah began digging through old documents, birth certificates, medical records, family home records, and there, she found something that froze her in place. Her real name wasn't Sarah. She had been adopted as a baby, and her real name had been changed. The name listed in the adoption records, the birth name nearly erased from history, was Eloise Harper. The same name as one of the children from the Harper family who had mysteriously disappeared in the Idaho mining town over 50 years ago. Sarah, or Eloise, couldn't process it. How could her life be intertwined with events she believed had nothing to do with her? How could every place she went bring back fragment of a past she had never experienced? But the final piece came when she received a letter. No sender, no stamp. It contained only one page. A photo of an old house in Oregon, taken from an odd angle, as if from above. In the second-story window, a young girl stands, gazing out. Her face is blurry, but the dress she wears is the one Sarah wore as a child. On the back of the photo, a single sentence is written. That name isn't for you, but the one calling her still comes. A few days after receiving the letter, Sarah began to see herself in other places. Not a shadow, not a reflection, but a real figure walking, standing, and sometimes staring straight at her before disappearing into the crowd. At the shopping mall, she saw a woman wearing the same red jacket as hers, buying coffee in the same line. The woman turned around, looked at Sarah, then smiled. The same smile as hers, but those eyes were empty, unblinking, unmoving. When Sarah approached, the figure had vanished. Some of her co-workers began to ask why Sarah hadn't said hello to them yesterday, or why she had been walking so quickly through the campus hallway. But Sarah hadn't been there that day. She began to lose control of her own version of events. One night, Sarah watched the security camera footage from her apartment. In the video, she saw herself leaving her apartment at 2 a.m, wearing blue pajamas, walking slowly toward the elevator. But when she replayed the video, the recording was gone. Sarah began writing about these incidents in a small diary, trying to stay sane. But the next day, the entries had changed. The handwriting was hers, but the words were not. On one page, it read, "I didn't copy you. I just got here first." Then a signature below, "Sarah." In the days that followed, she began having strange dreams. In her dreams, she was trapped in an old house with endless corridors. The walls were covered with empty picture frames, and every mirror reflected her with a distorted expression. The version of herself in the dream always said the same thing. "You are just one of many wearing this skin." One afternoon, Sarah came face to face with that figure. She was returning from the supermarket and saw herself standing in front of her apartment door. Not a shadow, not a delusion. The figure was wearing the same clothes, holding the same shopping bags, and staring directly at her. Sarah stopped. Her heart was racing. The figure smiled, raised its hand slowly, then knocked on the apartment door, the door that should only be able to be opened by one person, the real self. As Sarah approached and was about to scream, the door opened from the inside, and there stood another figure, the third version, the same face, the same skin. But the three of them didn't move. They just stared at Sarah with tilted heads, thin smiles, and empty black eyes. Sarah took a step back, but her body couldn't resist. Something inside her had been called, and now they were all waiting for that place to be empty. After that encounter, Sarah no longer lived in her apartment. She moved to a small motel outside the city, renting a windowless room with only a mattress and a slow-blinking neon light. But even there, the disturbances did not stop. She woke up every night, always at 3:17 a.m. It wasn't because of nightmares. It was because she felt something, another breath in the room, not hers. Sometimes it sounded close, like someone was lying right next to her. Sometimes it came from behind the closet, sometimes from the ceiling, but there was no one there. Just a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone was trying to breathe calmly in an unfamiliar body. Sarah began to note the times the sound occurred and noticed an odd pattern. Every time the breathing appeared, it coincided with reports of missing persons in the surrounding city. She followed the local news. Every time she felt its presence, a new name would appear in the police reports the next day, as if every time that entity moved, someone had to disappear. She tried going to church, but as soon as she entered, the entire room grew cold. The cross on the altar trembled. The small bell hanging on the door rang on its own. One of the parishioners sitting 2 rows in front of her fainted. Sarah wasn't kicked out, but the eyes of the other attendees stared at her as if they were seeing something she couldn't see herself. On one of her worst nights, Sarah tried to record herself sleeping. She placed the camera on top of the wardrobe and left it on all night. The next day, she watched the recording slowly. At first, everything seemed normal, but at 3:17, the lights in the room went out. The image went completely dark for 47 seconds, but the sound was still recorded. In the darkness, there was a sound of breathing, then footsteps approaching. Then, the sound of Sarah's body shifting position. Even though in the video, she appeared motionless. And after that, there was a whisper, not one voice, but many, as if there were more than one entity in the room. They whispered quickly in an unfamiliar language. But at the end of the recording, just before the lights came back on, one sentence was heard clearly. "You are borrowing time." Sarah closed the laptop. She didn't know where to go next, but her body was already changing. Not physically, but her presence. Some people started not seeing her when she was in the same room. Her voice sometimes wasn't heard. Her phone started showing dates that hadn't arrived yet, and her reflection in the mirror started lagging a few seconds, as if she and her reflection weren't part of the same time anymore. And every time she tried to take a deep breath to calm herself, she always felt something breathing with her, not outside her body, but from within. At the end of winter, Sarah disappeared. Not gone like she ran away, but vanished literally. The motel room where she last stayed was found open. The key was still hanging on the doorknob. All her belongings were there. Her wallet, phone, jacket, even the pair of shoes she usually wore. But there was no sign of her body. No exit trail. No cameras in the hallway captured her leaving the room. All that remained was a small mirror on the table, its surface covered in frost. On the glass, someone had written from the inside, "You're not the first." The police listed Sarah as missing, but no one really searched for her. Some assumed she had run away due to mental pressure. Others believed she had been kidnapped, but there was no evidence, no motive, no clues. But the story doesn't end there. Weeks after her disappearance, people who had known Sarah began reporting strange occurrences. A co-worker saw a woman resembling Sarah standing at the window of the archive room at night, even though the building was locked. A former professor heard someone calling her name from the attic of her house, with a voice identical to Sarah's. But security camera footage showed the house was empty. A cleaning staff member at the motel where Sarah had last stayed claimed to have seen the reflection of a woman's face in a room's mirror, even though no one was in the room. The most unsettling was an anonymous message sent to the local news hotline. It was just a voice, a 7-second recording, breathing, deep, slow, then one word, whispered softly. Here, a few days later, another missing person report surfaced. The same pattern. No traces, no damage, no explanation. And one more thing, every missing victim had been recorded at the same location as Sarah, whether at school, work, or simply in a hospital corridor. They all shared something, even if it was just a single second, a conversation, a glance. Now, in a world that seems normal and quiet, someone is beginning to realize that sometimes darkness doesn't come to us. Sometimes darkness wears our faces. And when it can't be distinguished from us, when its breath merges with our own, when its reflection no longer lingers, then we are no one. He was never found. No grave, no farewell, only a name that keeps appearing in places it shouldn't. A frozen mirror, a breath left behind, a face staring back, but never blinking. One by one, those who knew him began to disappear. Not because of time, but because of something waiting in the silence. Because once he came, he never truly left. And when you start to ask who you truly are, perhaps you are no longer yourself.